Hello everyone, I'm Isaac and I'm a sociologist, and I've been doing this series about research methods, and so far I've spoken about some broad logics. Today I'm going to talk about some more specific stuff about how you're actually going to go out and gather data, and I'm going to start by talking about surveys because they're one more straightforward ways to start thinking about the questions you ask and how you ask them. So, all of you have probably seen a survey before, right? This sort of Twitter poll is also a survey. Um, and the thing is, with all of these questions, sometimes the way that the question is asked, sometimes the way that the question is phrased, matters a lot to what you get to learn from the people you speak to. And so, I'm gonna first start this exploration into data gathering, by talking about survey questions. So, typically, when you do a survey, though, it is built with quantitative analysis in mind. You want to get a large sample size. The thing about large is that this depends. It depends on so many things. Anybody can argue something's big, something small, size is relative and all that, right? So yeah. But typically you want a larger sample size than you would if you're doing a different kind of study, like a qualitative one. But the thing is now, because you want to do a large sample size, you'll want to make sure that your questions are built in ways that every additional data point doesn't increase your analytical effort by too much. So to do this, you pre-categorize your responses. So like with a survey, right, you have maybe 4 options, 5 options. So each person you speak to afterwards, you already know which category they fall into. You don't need to think about it, be like, all right, so they said they liked it this way. Does this mean that they strongly agree? Does it mean that they only regular agree? So on and so forth. You just let them pick the category themselves straight up. But for this, right, yeah, this pre-categorization creates some new issues, some new concerns, and I'll be discussing that shortly. But for what it's worth, a survey needs to be made useful to hear from many people in a relatively short period of time. The relative here actually has to do with relative to other forms of social research, such as an interview. Because surveys themselves, they can be very long. You can ask people a lot of questions, and you can easily spend half an hour to an hour going through the list of questions with somebody. So, about constructing surveys, right? One of the biggest considerations you need to have, well, one of the first considerations you need to have is what level of measurement do you want? How do you want your data to get back to you? And there's 4 ways to think about this, 4 general levels of measurement. So first, you've got scale measurements. You can think of these as raw numbers, basically, things that can be added and subtracted sensibly. For instance, if I'm using age, right, I have a survey question that goes on and asks, all right, may I know how old you are? Or may I know the year that you were born? And then afterwards, you do the math and subtract from the year the survey was done. These raw numbers, you can make sense of them together, right? You can add and subtract them sensibly. If someone's 26 years old and someone is 24, you know that in 2 years' time, the 24-year-old will also be 26. Same thing with years worked, right? If you have 1 year of experience, you have 2 less years of experience than somebody with 3. So that is what a ratio measurement is. So sometimes you want a raw number. But other times, maybe the raw number itself is not so useful. You want a range. Income is one of those items that commonly shows up in surveys in interval form. They'll ask you, all right, may I know which of these ranges your income for the last year has fallen into? 0 to 1,000, 1,001 to 3,000, so on and so forth. The thing here about meaningful distance is that these brackets you select, these gaps you choose, need to mean something. Why am I doing 0 to 1,000? Maybe in the area that I'm doing my study in, I found that if you earn below 1,000 monthly, you are basically below the poverty line. You will struggle to get by. And so that's something I want to look for. That's something I want to measure. And you can see how that may be more useful than asking people exact numbers. Because let's say I know that this person earns 950 and that person earns 850 and another person earns 750. That's not going to the experience in the area that I'm trying to understand or analyze is not going to vary too much because they're all still going to struggle to get by in an expensive place. So instead, you do these brackets in advance, and at the same time with income, sometimes it gives people it makes it easier for them to choose an option because not everybody has consistent incomes, but you can have a rough idea about which window you're in. So yeah, interval variables have a meaningful distance between these numbers. The thing about ratio and interval, all of these can be added and subtracted sensibly. Even intervals, if you know somebody's 0 to 1,000 and another person's 1,001 to 3,000, at the very least, there's a $1 difference in their earnings, and at the very most, there's a $3,000 difference in their earnings. This can be sensibly done. Now, with categorical measurements, you cannot do this. The next bit I'm going to talk about is ordinal. So, actually, I'm going to start with nominal. I'm going to talk about nominal variables first. So, the thing about categorical measurement is that you can distinguish between categories. You can distinguish between categories, but you can't do anything else about them. That's what a nominal variable is. So, for instance, you can, by certain logics, argue that there is a difference between men and women and non-binary people. So, gender can be a nominal variable. You can categorize them. But it does not have the scale measurement logic where you can add and subtract them sensibly, right? A non-binary person, you can't subtract a woman from a non-binary person and get a man. That is absolutely not how it works. They're just separate and distinct categories. So that's the core logic of a categorical variable. Distinctions, but you cannot add or subtract. Now, from nominal variables, right, there is no ordering logic. You cannot say that men come before women or men should be ranked higher than women or whatever. That's just sexism, right? Some people will try and do this, but they're being sexist or they're being racist when it comes to ethnicity. But ordinal variables, you can order and rank them. Let's say you're talking about education levels, right? You could argue that you have to clear primary education before you can enter secondary education, so on and so forth. So if you have this sort of ordering logic, that's what ordinal represents here, an ordering logic, you can talk about it this way. Other common ordinal measurements involve ideas of whether you strongly agree or strongly disagree with something. You can arrange that, you can order that in terms of whether how agreeable they are to this idea or how opposed to this idea they might be. So that's the point about ordering logic. But of all of these, you cannot add or subtract them in any sensible way. You cannot do primary school twice and get into secondary school. So that is a distinction between these levels of measurement. And something to note is that they are hierarchical. If you measure your data in ratio form first, you can collapse it later. So let's say I went out there with my income question and I asked raw income first. Afterwards, I decide to collapse it. You can. I can take the 750, 850, 950 person, put them in the same category of 0 to 1000. But if I ask the category of 0 1000 first, and that's what they told me, there's no way for me to say, all right, I'm going to pretend all of them are 500. It's a middle number. No, it's not possible because everyone responds to that, maybe more to one side or the other, and you cannot know. So that's the point about them being hierarchical. If you start raw numbers, you can collapse them downwards. But at the same time, if you ask a raw number, you may have trouble getting a response. And I will talk more about this later. So with categorical variables, same thing. From interval, you can collapse it in ordinal form. Let's say instead of an income range, you want to think about this in terms of class. So you can say that, all right, people in these income ranges are upper class. People in this income range is upper middle. Next one is middle, so on and so forth, right? But if you ask them their class first, or if you measure their class in some other way first, you cannot say, all right, all the upper middle people actually earn this much. You will not know. And yeah, obviously you can collapse ordinal down to nominal if you want. But sometimes that also begs the question of, so let's say a nominal variable, right, income or class related. Maybe you want to know if they have a car or if they have a computer or whatever. You could just ask the question instead of asking them the income and then guessing later if they can afford a car. So here are some illustrations of these levels of measurement for the same concept. So let's say I want to measure material possessions, right? You can ask them the ratio variable as I described earlier. Tell me what was your income before taxes last year, and you get a raw number. So from there, you could also instead ask, all right, may I know which of the following categories best represents your average monthly income before taxes last year? And you give them a whole bunch of options. They pick the one that's representative of them. The thing with this is that you can start gathering this data from many, many people. Respondent 1 says they are an option 2. Respondent 2 says that they're an option 3. Respondent 4 says they're option 2, so on and so forth. And now you have a nice gathering of data, right? You understand that, all right, most of my sample, yeah, they say that they are in the 1,001 to 3,000 range, so on and so forth. You can ask this question in ordinal form. In our society, there are groups which tend to have more and groups which tend to have less. Where would you place yourself on this scale? This is actually a common item that I've seen before in other surveys. It's a self-reported social class measure. Note as well that there is a distinction between this ordinal and interval measurements. If you're dealing with class or material possessions and you ask them the income, when you think about this later in your analysis, this is you as the researcher determining that, all right, because they earn this much, they are in this class. But this may not correspond with the way they feel about their position. Someone may not earn as much as you think they need, but for them, they may think this is all they need and they are fine with it. And so they're like, yeah, I think I'm number 4. I'm almost there. I almost have more, but yeah, it's fine. It's good enough for me. So even this kind of question, these levels of measurement, the stuff you are asking, affect the information you get back. Because are you going to deal with this as self-reported class or analytically understood class? Or researcher-determined class? Those are ways you can think about it. And obviously from there, you can also do a nominal version of this question, measure material possessions, right? You can ask them to check off these things. These 5 options I put here are a Singaporean stereotype of the 5 C's. It's a very outdated stereotype because, as far as I know, everyone has a credit card now. Everyone kind of has. Well, if you don't have cash, yeah, that's kind of it, right? Credit cards used to have like basic limits, so you need to earn a certain amount before banks would give them to you. But yeah, that doesn't really matter anymore. It's a super outdated metric. But I put it here because I thought it's funny, and it does represent a nominal question in a way. Ask people to check off the boxes that they have, tell you what they do have or do not have, if you want to understand, if you want to measure their material possessions. So after levels of measurement, these are more theoretical, conceptual things to pay attention to. When you build a question, a very important thing in all research, and I'll emphasize this across any sort of data gathering approach, whether it's surveys, whether it's interviews, whether it's focus groups, so on and so forth. You need to know whether your question is useful. The difference here is that the usefulness of questions varies. The measurements for these vary across different data gathering approaches. In a survey, 2 big things to consider are validity and reliability. So you need to be sure if your question explores what you think it's exploring. So let's say back to these questions, right? If I wanted to understand self-reported class, but I ask income, that's not a very valid response. I will not get an understanding of how they feel about themselves in terms of class hierarchy if I only ask the income. Instead, I need to ask this. So that's the thing. You need to think about if your question explores what you think it's exploring. If you want to find out something, make sure your question is asking about that. Sorry about that. Next bit. You need to think about whether your question is reliable. In the quantitative researchers talk about this in terms of consistency, whether you get consistent responses. A way to think about this is, are your questions understandable? For instance, if you ask a question about, have more, have less, right? But in your target population, everybody thinks about it in a very different sense. Like maybe some people don't even think about this as having more or having less in the first place. So you show them this question, and they're like, yeah, no, I don't know, I don't know what to respond with this. Then that may not be a very reliable question. The idea is that if someone shows this question to the same person again, will you get the same response each time? Yeah, and that's something to consider about reliability. Do you get consistent responses? And very, very importantly, this one I think is more universal across all data gathering approaches. It's whether your question helps you understand your specific research question. Are you finding out what you want to find out from the angles that suit your interest? I'll be discussing this further with an example. Because research agendas, what you hope to find out, what you hope to do with the work you create, matters a lot. And some approaches expose yourself or expose your respondents or your interlocutors to certain misinterpretations or to certain abuses. And so you need to be very careful with whether this question helps you in the way that you want, helps you do what you want. Yeah. Beyond usefulness, right? You need to think about now. Now you need to consider your interviewees, your respondents. Are you giving them a difficult time with this? Can they respond to your question? So first, how answerable is it, right? Is your question clear? So a common thing is sometimes you may be tempted to phrase a thing this way. Maybe that's just the idea that came to your mind at first. Does it seem impossible to you that this thing never happened or this thing happened, right? So with a phrasing like this, like, okay, so are you asking me if it's impossible to me or if it's not impossible, so on and so forth? It might be clearer to just phrase this as, does it seem possible to you that this happened? Or does it seem possible to you that this did not happen? So on and so forth. You also want to avoid double-barreled questions. For instance, with this, right, the respondent may only find it important or they may only find it interesting and not the other. Now, are they supposed to respond to this question? You're like, yeah, I find it important but not interesting. So do I just pick the middle number? Do I just pick the middle response? Do I say no because this double barrel, I don't agree with both barrels? These issues of clarity affect reliability noticeably as well. So you want to make sure that clarity is there. Okay? After that, you also want to think about whether your question is relevant to your target population. Because you want them to be able to answer this from their experience or point of view. This is a thing about social research. Why am I even asking someone else? I'm asking somebody else because they have a unique set of experiences or understandings that I do not know. I cannot simply and think about it and philosophize about it and come to an understanding. I need to learn from this person what their experience is. And with that in mind, so this is a very blunt way. You can't ask an unmarried person when they first got married, but you also cannot ask them things about what do they think about the married life or married experiences. Because while they can answer yes, I think married life is like this, or I think married life should be like this. These are also hypotheticals, and this sort of syncs up with this as well, right? Beyond hypotheticals where you can think about stuff that you have not experienced, there are also things which you have experienced which are impossible to recall. And so this is something else you want to avoid. Like, yes, we have all spoken to somebody in our lives before. Like the first time you spoke to somebody, that is an experience. But can we remember this? Very unlikely. So you need to make sure that your question is relevant to them. Do they have the experiences for this? Do they have the memories of it? And also, are they willing to share? And that's the next point I want to talk about here. So this is linked to answerability. In fact, all these three aspects about whether your question is useful, whether your question is answerable, whether they're influential, they're all interlinked. And so there is some overlap with this. But here, first, you want to think about whether your question would lead respondents towards certain responses. Do you think it's good? So here, right, you are putting in, if you put in this value judgment, that, do you think it's good that this happens? The thing about a leading question is not that it makes them answer something. It's not that it makes them give a certain response. It's that it makes them have to deal with this thing before they can do anything else. It's like somebody wants to walk somewhere, and you bring them down a different path first. Now they have to figure out whether they can get to where they want to go from that path, or if they have to backtrack and all. And it's high effort on both ways. So here, this value judgment on executions, on the death penalty, which Singapore has, and personally, I think it's a bad thing. But if you want to talk about this value judgment in this question here, somebody who disagrees the value will have to first address that before they can talk about the rest. In a survey, especially, they will not have space for this. They will not have space to address that first. They'll just see the options. You think it's good? You think it's bad? And the options are yes, no, or strongly agree, so on and so forth, right? They have to immediately start dealing with that, and it's very frustrating. It's very, it can incline them towards confusion as well, right? It can incline them towards like just messing with the question, or they may not know how to respond, just leave it. On that note, create difficulty. You also need to think about, is this going to put them in a difficult situation? Personally, is this going to incriminate them in something possibly? For instance, can you straight up ask somebody if they've engaged in shoplifting in the last 6 months, if it's a known crime? Can you ask somebody if they've straight up engaged in digital piracy in the last 6 months, if it's a known crime, right? How might they respond to this? How might you feel about this if somebody asks you? It's one thing to hear this from a friend. It's one thing to joke around with a friend, like, oh yeah, remember that time that I torrented this video? And then we watched together and the subtitles were all wrong. So there's one thing to do that, and it's another thing to have a complete stranger who may or may not represent an authority who can get you in trouble, asking you if you've done these things before. So consider this. Also consider other aspects of difficulty in the sense of social desirability. So you might ask somebody, what do you think about a certain style of dress or a certain kind of person? And while you ask them this, you, the interviewer, or people around them look like that. So if you do that, right, what do you think about men with long hair, for instance, and your interviewer is a man with long hair? How's your respondent supposed to deal with this, right? It creates difficulty for them to answer this. So you want to pay attention to these aspects. And you also want to consider the prime effect. My earlier questions prime respondents towards certain answers. And this is a thing from a study that was done in I believe in the middle of the Cold War. Some scientists, basically social scientists, basically tested priming effects by asking people if they felt that the US should accept USSR journalists into the US or vice versa. So depending on the order they ask question, the US should accept USSR journalists or the USSR should accept US journalists. Ideas of reciprocity or whatever affected their subsequent responses. So similarly, if your survey first asks, how important is equality to you, right? And they answered this already. They already told you that, yes, equality is incredibly important to me. And then later you ask them, all right, do you feel like laws against homosexual relationships should be repealed? And so this concerns equality, right? Now, are they going to answer this based on their previous response? And the thing is, there's nothing wrong with with finding this out. It's important, in fact, to find out. Like in terms of social research, these are elements of discourse. You want to know how certain ideas or certain conversations or certain approaches to things may lead people to respond in certain ways with other issues. This is useful and important. But in your survey, if you ask this in a survey, you have no idea if this question affected this response. There's the possibility it affected, but you have no idea if it did. And that will make it a very difficult survey question. In a survey, as far as possible, you don't want to prime respondents towards later answers because that just creates analytical problems for you. So, having covered all of these, right, I want to discuss an actual study on piracy, studying digital piracy, that I think had a lot of problems. And my experience dealing with this was that I worked on I I basically was looking into ways to study digital piracy, and I came across this study in 2017. Okay, so the finding of the study that the newspapers picked up on was that 2 in 5 people in Singapore actively stream pirated content. Actively stream pirated content. It was done by this. It was done by a research agency. It was done by this research agency, commissioned by an industry group. So already some research agenda stuff is getting clear here, right? These companies own the rights to sell such material, such entertainment material, and so they are experiencing loss. They would like a lot of companies call this loss, but it's really just people who aren't paying for the stuff. People aren't buying from them directly. So people weren't buying from them directly. They have an interest to try and get people to buy from them directly or understand why people aren't buying from them directly. So they did this study, right? How prevalent is piracy? How many people are not buying from us? And yeah, why might people not buy from us? So yeah, the study's focus was to well, based on the emergent report. So this is another issue with this study. I cannot find documentation that talks about the intent before they started survey. All of this is from their released reports. The links will be provided on the subsequent slides, and I'll put them in the description below as well. So they want to find out the extent of digital piracy in Singapore, the methods for such digital piracy, and how to stop this so that broadcasting companies can maybe earn more money. So, based off the study, the research agency put forth 2 major arguments. The first is that piracy has become socially acceptable and normalized. The second is that people are unwilling to admit to pirating. So, there's already an apparent contradiction between this, right? So if piracy is normalized, why are people unwilling to admit to pirating in their study? And so what I cannot explain, like why they came to these arguments. I cannot fully explain why they came to these arguments. I can put forth a discussion about their proposed actionables and about the questions that they asked, and that's what I'm going to do next. So first, what was the proposed actionable? Was the study effective, right? They proposed that they create roadblocks. Let's make piracy difficult. To reduce piracy, let's make piracy difficult. Okay, sure. So what's even funnier about this conclusion, right, is that they could have presented this without surveying people. You don't need to survey people to do this. They have a data point right here to justify their argument to make piracy difficult. To make piracy less common, let's make piracy difficult. Right? To make piracy less common, let's make piracy difficult. You could have done this without interviewing thousands of 1,308 Singaporeans as described in the survey methodology. So yeah, straightforward and actionable. But is this a useful recommendation? Was this actionable, something that led to any sort of change in piracy behaviors or in company profits or whatever, right? First, it was acted upon based on their recommendations and some pressure from the industry interest group, Kasaba. They proposed that the government, basically bans illegal streaming devices. Essentially, there were these set-top boxes, little electronic devices that you could plug into your TV. The box essentially received data over the internet from certain streaming sites or certain streaming services that were not the official rights holders. And with this data, it processes it and then it plays it on the TV. So you could watch like live football matches or whatever without paying the official distributor. So the Singapore government found this very actionable. They banned the sale of this. They raided the shops that sold them. They blocked various IP addresses linked to these digital streaming services. They arrested and fined, distributors of these boxes. So they did this, and nothing changed. So they did all this, and in 2020, right, a study also commissioned. So this Asia Video Industry Association, right, AVIA, is essentially Kasaba renamed. It is the same company. If you go to a website, it is the same company, same coalition basically. So they commissioned a new study in 2020, 3 years after that, and a full year after the government straight up banned all of this and straight up started arresting people for it. And they found that 17% of consumers pirate. For reference, the Sycamore study noted that 18 to 24% admitted piracy downloads, and 10% of consumers use an ISD to stream pirated content. So illegal streaming devices are still being used in 2020, even though all these blocks happened, right? So people are clearly putting an effort to get around these restrictions. People are clearly people don't care about these restrictions, right? Something is going on here. People don't care about this. But why? Like, if you did a study, you surveyed 1,000 over people, and you understood the prevalence of piracy, and you understood the reasons for piracy, and you got the government to address it. You made piracy harder. Um, why did nothing change? And I fundamentally believe that all of this has to do with the way that the questions were asked, the kinds of questions that they asked. And I'm going to unpack that. So, two plausible reasons related to the questions they asked, and this is just the question phrasing. It's not about the methodology of how they delivered the survey, how they got responses. But one, the questions do not provide a valid understanding of how Singaporeans view digital streaming and digital piracy. They don't understand how Singaporeans or why Singaporeans care about piracy or why Singaporeans want to pirate. Secondly, I think the questions do not provide a reliable estimate. And it's not a reliable estimate because people responding to the survey would not admit to certain things or would not describe certain things as one of the conclusions was. I'm going to evaluate these things from the angles of agenda and the angle of influence. And after that, I'll discuss some ways to better ask these questions so that maybe we can better understand how piracy works in social life in Singapore. So these are the study's key questions. Something that stands out to me, so this is the link for the study. I will put it in the description below as well if you want to read it yourself, the full report. Based on the report, right, this is the item that they asked. My understanding is that they show them all of these questions, possibly one at a time, and ask them to tick the boxes. So, have you ever downloaded a movie or TV show from a website for free? No subscription charge or payment required. If you have, you say yes. And then now you are part of this number that shows up later. So 67% of respondents to the survey. So something to emphasize here that this is a sample, okay? 67% of people in their sample say this. 67% of people in the sample say this, so on and so forth. So, something that stands out to me, the questions, is that they cared about wording. They know that there's something important with the way you phrase your questions, right? That things might influence them in certain ways. Because they asked both about whether they streamed their movie or TV through a device that connects to the internet, 2 asterisks. The full statement includes, and this is a bit small, but the full statement includes Android box, media box, Roku stick, and not one of the devices sold by major telcos in Singapore. So essentially, devices that are not sold or distributed by the stakeholders in Kasaba, the industry group. Okay, so they asked them, have you ever streamed through a device that's basically not distributed by the industry group? And you can see the interest here, compared to have you streamed a pirated movie or TV show, right? So asking them if they've streamed a pirated show, they ask them 2 separate questions. One, possibly because they guess that if you ask them piracy straight up, they're going to say no. And that does seem to appear here, right? Only 7% say they have streamed a pirated show, or 5% say they've accessed a pirated sports event. But 50 over percent have streamed through a device not distributed at Kasaba. The interesting thing here is, what is the definition of piracy, right? So here, all of them, the entire report discusses this as piracy. Anything that's not from our rights holders is an act of piracy. Is an act of stealing. Is an act of breaking the law. But these devices themselves, because all they did was exclude certain things, some of them may be legal, some of them may be accessible or free, or they may think about this in terms of, so if you see the word stream through a device that connects to your TV and connects to the internet, you can set up a Raspberry Pi. You can plug a computer into your TV and use that instead of a smart TV, right? Technically, if I plug my computer into a TV, I have to respond yes to this question, but not to this. I may not engage in the illegal activity that I'm afraid of. But they use this distinction to claim that, oh, look, people are unwilling to admit to pirating, which also is something that they thought about first when they built these questions. So what I want to emphasize here is that this categorization may not be fair to the respondents, and it is from this unfairness that all these matters of influence now stem. Oh yeah, and the reason why these are unfair is because their agenda is to benefit certain stakeholders, StarHub, Singtel, the big Singaporean telcos that do have the rights to sell these things in Singapore. So, first major problem, this term of piracy, right, as discussed earlier. Yeah, do the surveyors, do the researchers, and the respondents share the same understanding of what piracy is? And the thing is, the next bit, the influence of a term such as piracy, right? Are they creating a self-justifying campaign? Is this a truism? Because if you're going to say that, oh yeah, this is such a bad word, that if I say this word, people are going to say, no, I have never pirated. Then, okay, you're going to go out there and you're going to be... It's the same thing as asking, all right, have you ever eaten meat? That's one question. And then the next question is, have you ever taken a life? Right? And maybe with this approach, you're like, yeah, people see take a life, and then now they're gonna think, oh yeah, so meat eating is bad. I'm taking lives, or plant eating is bad, right? Have you ever eaten a plant? That's taking a life too. So have you ever eaten food, and have you ever taken a life? Same thing here. Is there a truism going on that's creating a self-justifying campaign with their use of the term piracy? And all of this conflation creates problems with validity. So the next thing, right, is that they themselves know, the researchers themselves know, that respondents do not perceive piracy the same way as survey designers. They note that legality, according to their respondents, the respondents didn't think about illegality when they are engaging in their actions. They talk about this, oh yeah, they're doing this because it's free, it's convenient, it's easier than doing other approaches. And that is why their proposal is to make piracy, to reduce piracy, let's make it difficult. Because right now it's easy. But yeah, back to the issue of piracy. So what's especially interesting to me is how this study, in reporting it, took their lack of definition to be a selling point. Their respondents don't care, they note that the respondents don't care about legality, but the study and the study sponsors talk about piracy as an issue of legality, and they're focused on that. And so, because of all of this, it seems like a very invalid way to come to the conclusion. This is, to me, I believe that they have severely underreported piracy. So if we go back to these numbers, right? I think these numbers are very low. And not from a matter of like people don't want to say piracy, because yes, that is true. People don't want to simply report that they're engaging in a crime, somebody who looks suspicious of them or wary of them. But this number itself, it doesn't give a clear picture of how many people do this, and that might explain why the stats haven't changed. Because while they may have targeted certain people and certain approaches, other people who are interested, who were not covered by the survey because no, I don't pirate, they never got to understand them. And so it skipped past that became useless. So for all of this, we need to improve validity. How will we go about doing that? How will we go about making these questions better? I want to start by talking about how to understand piracy behaviors. It's important to first define piracy. Make it clear. If they want to talk about legality, they want to talk about rights holders, just put that there. Be explicit about it. It's fine if your research agenda is out there in your paper, because at least then the researcher and respondent are on the same page. They understand the same thing. And this is how social research for understanding. Social research is to understand each other, to understand other people, so you can build things from there. So yes, you would need this, right? This would be a straightforward start for it. But beyond validity, right, there's reliability. So how do you get respondents to admit to engaging in illegal activity, right? Because if you define piracy as illegal, if you define piracy as extra legal or illegal, right? Now, they're going to see the piracy question. Have you ever pirated? You just asked me earlier if it's illegal. Of course, I'm not going to say it here, right? And also ethical concerns. Will you be getting them to self-incriminate? How do you get around these two issues of influence and, well, difficulty, right? Self-incrimination. To get around these two issues, I would say the most basic step is to guarantee anonymity and immunity. And the fun thing is, you can work this into question directly. So, this is an approach to work it directly into a question, to put anonymity straight into a question. Um, this researcher, Judith Miller, proposed an item count or a paired list method. It's got two names. If you search Google Scholar for this, you'll find quite a few of it. You'll find both terms. But the entire idea, the core idea, is to split your sample into two equivalent groups and provide an identical list of items except the treatment item. So let's say I have budget to talk to 1,000 people of certain demographics, certain age ranges, certain ethnicities or genders, maybe income ranges. I take my 1,000 sample of 1,000 and I split them accordingly into two groups with the same demographic distributions. Now with these two groups, they will get two different lists of questions. The control group basically sees a bunch of items. So you ask them, how many of the following activities have you engaged in during the last 6 months? Please report only the total count. And by reporting only the total count, people will not know if the incriminating item, so the treatment group gets this, right? You will not know if this, it's impossible for the researcher to ever know. This is the best part. The researcher will never know if the one person responding to the survey right now is a person who has also done this. They could say they've done 3 things. It could be these 3. It might not be these 3. And so the idea for this is that your treatment group will score higher than your control group on average. When it scores higher than control group on average, from there you can work out proportion-wise, right, mathematically, and all the calculations are in the article linked. I'll put the link in the description as well. So all the math can be done for you to figure out now, all right, based on this, what is the proportion of Singaporeans who do engage in piracy activity? And one last thing to flag with this approach. So, like, while this is very, very useful, it is also important to make sure that your items never bottom or cap out. Because, for instance, if all of these things are unrelatable, and people are going to average zero for the control list. If you average zero the control list, then people are going to see this and be like, oh, if I say yes, nobody does these things. Since nobody does these things, if I give a score of 1, they're going to recognize that my score of 1 is for this item. I'm going to say I did 0 in the end. So you want to make sure it never bottoms out. And you want to make sure it doesn't cap out either. Because if like all of these 3 things are super common, then yeah, the person can be like, everybody does this. So if I say I have a score of, I can't say I have a score of 3. I have to say I have a score of 4 to be honest. But if I'm honest and say 4, then people will know that I've done the 4th bad activity, right? So yeah, I want to spread this out a bit. You'll want to make sure that it never bottoms or caps out. But that's just a little flag question. But hopefully from this, you can also see how it is entirely possible to weave anonymity into the questions themselves. And by caring about how your respondents understand your questions, about how they feel when they see these questions, how they perceive them, how they might respond, this is how you can get to a better understanding of social situations, of social contexts. Because what we do want is openness. We want to understand. But this openness, this understanding should not come at the cost of also, incriminating your interviewees or causing them problems, causing them difficulty. If you are interested to talk more about this, I'm glad to. Feel free to drop a message in the comments, and yeah, we can talk about it. But as a recap for this session, essentially when planning survey questions, you want to consider first the levels of measurement, right? How's your data getting back to you? Is this useful for what you want to understand? Then you also want to consider the validity, reliability, and whether these questions align with your research intent. So the thing about the Kasaba piracy study is that it did align the research intent. It's now the problem is that after aligning the research intent, it does not help them understand the target population. So while the questions may have been clear and relevant, right? Like yes, Singaporeans do engage in these activities, and yes, they can talk about these from experience. Singaporeans will not want to tell you that they have done this stuff because you have framed the entire thing to be a problem. And or they have framed the entire thing in a confusing manner and there may not even be agreement in the first place. So when you're playing survey questions, you want to make sure all of these are there. And yeah, hopefully this is a good start for you to think about asking questions. In subsequent videos, I'll probably talk about how to do data gathering in other forms, such as interviews, more qualitative approaches. And yeah, thank you very much for listening. Once again, I'm Isaac, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you.